Well, welcome to another Faith Roots Walk and Talk. And we're getting close to Easter. And one of the things that's really sort of grown as a trend, really over the last sort of 15, 20 years, is the attempt, particularly around Monday, Thursday, the day before Good Friday, of churches attempting to replicate the Passover and to do what is known as a seder meal, a Jewish seder. The seder is how Jews today would observe Passover. With a meal with key elements in it from the original Passover, with psalms and with some liturgy. And I think it comes from two places. One is a desire to know and understand Judaism better, but particularly sort of linking that to a desire to get a feel for what it would have been like for the disciples having that first Last Supper. And I just want to pick up on it because actually this is quite a controversial thing. So the Council for Christians and Jews have put together a booklet, and they've argued that you shouldn't attempt to put on a Seder meal, which then sort of combines it into communion, the Lord's Supper. And their reasons are as follows. Their argument is that we should, as Christians, want to get to know and understand our Jewish neighbours better, to understand Judaism. But they identify three problems with attempting to do this. The first is that they question whether or not what Jesus and the disciples took part in that night before his crucifixion was in fact a Passover meal. And their argument there is that there are, they call them discrepancies. I'll go back into that in a little while, but that there are challenges as we look at how John's Gospel describes the timing of Passover and how the other Gospels describe what is happening. The second reason is that the Seder is, as it is today, and as it is often done at these kinds of presentations for Christians, is a post AD 70 development. That after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, after it was no longer possible to go into Jerusalem to the temple, then how Passover was celebrated was adapted. It had to be adapted because you couldn't make the kinds of offerings that you would have done in that way, and it had to be adapted because the Israelites, God's people, the Jews, were being scattered and spread around the Roman Empire, even more than before, and so the meal changed, it evolved, it developed, and a lot of the kind of liturgy that we see today, that you would see in a modern day Seder, is not the liturgy, not the ceremony, not the ritual that you would have seen if you had attended and participated in the Passover in Jesus' time. In other words, if you're trying to say to people, look, this is the seder meal that Jesus would have had, this is the meal that he would have been having as the Last Supper, then you are historically incorrect. Here's the third thing. There's a particular concern that they're expressing, which is this, that this is perceived as appropriation. It's taking a Jewish, ethnic, cultural and religious event and appropriating it for ourselves, for Christianity. And by putting Jesus at the heart of it and making it a Christian thing, the argument's been made that there's two things. One, that it feeds into a particular form of theology known as replacement theology, which is the idea that the church replaces Israel, that Christianity, that Christians, that we replace the Jews. And secondly, because of that, becomes tied up with anti-Semitism. And that's important because one of the ways that anti-Semitism has been experienced by Jews throughout history is that they have been treated cruelly, horrifically. They've been forced to live as outcasts, not able to participate fully in societies. They've been subject to derogatory caricatures, and of course, with the pogroms and that kind of thing, they've experienced violence and murder. And one of the reasons made for that is this sort of idea that the Jews rejected Jesus, that the Jews killed Jesus. And that's why in that replacement theology they're seen as having been replaced. And I want to, first of all, just pick up on that. We're going to come back to that third issue shortly. But anti-Semitism and this idea of replacement is significant. It's significant because Jews have experienced this horrific evil throughout their history. And there's a tendency at times to think, oh, it's just about the Holocaust, it's just about Nazi Germany. But actually, this is the history of what Jews have experienced around Europe. If you're watching and listening in here in the United Kingdom, then it's important for us to recognise that our history is as horrific in terms of anti-Semitism. If you want to see some physical evidence and reminders of that, here's two things. Go and look at where historic synagogues were. And you'll discover that they're often on the outskirts, on the original boundaries of towns and cities, because they were out, they were exiled, they were out. Sometimes even being placed sort of close to sort of leper colonies and that kind of thing. In effect, being told, we're treating you as unclean. And there is other sort of evidence in our history. Look at the historical evidence of things that happened. One particular symbol is when you go to York in northern England. Right in the middle of York, there's the old castle, and there's most of the sort of what is referred to as the castle is a more recent museum. I say modern, it's not that modern. But the older part is a traditional tower on top of a hill. It's called Clifford's Tower. And it's an empty shell. And there at Clifford's Tower, Jews were trapped and burnt alive. That's the history of anti-Semitism here in England. And of course, it's a live event. We've seen back before the pandemic here in the United Kingdom, there was this horrific moment where a mainstream political party, the Labour opposition, saw anti-Semitism become so entrenched and so visible and blatantly denied within the higher echelons of the party. And that is still being worked through, and I'm not sure completely dealt with now. But I can say it is not just it's not just a Labour Party thing. I was a member of one of the other political parties. As a student, I was a member of the Conservative Party, and I remember I had a friend who was in the party, and he was Jewish, and he experienced anti-Semitism, and I heard anti-Semitic remarks, and I have to recognise and repent that whilst I didn't share in them, I did not challenge them enough. So it's there. It's a real problem. You still hear it today. You hear it in churches, you hear it in society, you hear it in culture, and some of the mythology, horrific, hysterical mythology around that. The use of anti-Semitic tropes. It's acceptable, it seems, to use them in mainstream newspapers, in their caricatures, in their cartoons. So that's when you see these sort of myths going that the Jews that are in Israel today are they're not really truly ethnic Jews, that they're sort of Europeans that have taken on Judaism, and no factual evidence for that at all, just completely, absolutely made up. You see that in the way that some of the debate about modern day Israel and Palestine and Gaza is handled. And let's be clear, it is perfectly reasonable to criticise the actions of Israel in Gaza. And there may be some disagreement over that. It's possible to disagree with what Israel is doing in Gaza and on the West Bank as well. But the way that some of that debate is handled, the way that Holocaust comparisons are deliberately made between modern day Israel, the way that Israel is often judged by different standards to the rest of the world, and the way in which Jews are, whether or not they agree politically with Benjamin Netanyahu, as though every Jew is responsible for what the Israeli government do. Those are all examples of anti-Semitism going on. The way that Jews here in Britain, because of how that got involved in the protests happening on a Saturday, on a Jewish holy day, on their Sabbath in London every week for a significant period of time, marching past synagogues and those kinds of things, with genocidal chants like "from the rivers to the sea." All of that contributes to this culture of fear for Jews seeking to live their lives in Britain. So I wanted to get that up there, up front at the start, because that should affect our thinking and our conversation here. That's the backdrop, that's the context to conversations about should Christians do seder meals to mark the Last Supper. So I wanted to just come back and think through those concerns and those challenges there, and then I'm going to come back with my sort of best answer on this, because I think that there are good reasons for not doing that, not having those kind of seders that the Council for Christians and Jews and others have raised this as well. I think there's some question marks as well. So let's go through them in turn. So the first one, was the Last Supper a Passover meal? Now, yeah, there is some work that we have to do in understanding the timing of things and what's going on between John's dating of the Passover and the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John's dating of the Passover. Nothing there that isn't resolvable. And I think probably the simplest answer is that we shouldn't see a legalistic that everything all had to happen at a specific time on a specific day. And we can understand that today, can't we? We can understand how sort of some people would put most of their Christmas celebration on the 25th of December and others on the 24th of December, noting that you've also got a whole Christian tradition, the Eastern Orthodox, that would wait until early January before the big celebrations around about the 6th of January. And all of that within a festival that is actually meant to last for a good 12 days, with a build-up, a fasting period through Advent of a month. I also, when we were at Bearwood, the pastor of a church that had 4 congregations meeting on a Sunday and one on a Saturday evening, and the Saturday evening one was increasingly becoming a church plant in its own right, and it was multilingual. And we would often try and bring the 2 Sunday mornings. Every year we try to bring the 2 Sunday morning congregations together for an Easter Sunday gathering. But we kept our Sunday night congregation, and we kept going as usual with a big Easter event. And Nueva Vida, the Saturday night congregation, they would mark Easter on Saturday evening. So they kind of went early. So I don't think there's any reason why we can't factor in the possibility that there would have been variations about when you sat down to the meal. The crucial point is, if you look at Luke 21, I think it is, you look at the Synoptic Gospels, they're very clear that Jesus sends his disciples to get ready to prepare so that they can eat the Passover meal. That's quite explicit. And I think there's evidence within how the meal is happening and some of the things that are there that is what is happening. Now, let's come to the second point. That the seder meal that is often used as the basis for these kind of events is something that evolved after AD 70, so that isn't the meal that Jesus was having. That is 100% right. Now, I want to just put one little exception in here, which is this, that if you have Christians from a Jewish background, and I want to talk particularly about Messianic Jews, then that Seder meal will be the one that they are used to. And it will, because of how it's evolved and developed, it will reflect and speak into and speak for Jewish experience, not just of the original Passover, but of what happened in AD 70, what has happened through Jewish history since, and what happened in the Holocaust. And I think if you are a Messianic Jew, if you're a Jewish Christian, if you are a church that's serving a community where there are Jews becoming Christians, I think that you would absolutely legitimately want to draw upon all of that and to say that you want to look at, observe and remember what has happened to your people throughout history. And if you are Christian church leaders in that kind of context, and you are Gentile, then you will want to sensitively, with Jewish believers, find ways of saying, we stand with you. But in the vast majority of cases, I am with those who say that this is not the right thing to be trying to take a meal that in effect is a different meal, that is doing a bit more than looking back to the original Passover, the original Exodus. I don't think we should be trying to take that and appropriate it and take it in. And I would agree, if you want to build friendship and relationship with Jewish friends, then there are other ways of doing that. Listen to them, hear their experiences, talk with them about how they look at Scripture and interpret it. You may, if you build a good friendship, be invited to a Shabbat, a Friday night meal. And I've had the privilege actually of being invited by a friend to their Friday evening Shabbat meal. I've also had the privilege of being invited to an iftar, the breaking of a fast for some of my Muslim friends. But I believe that we shouldn't be saying we are going to try and recreate your meal at a significant time in order to try and understand you, and certainly not to say to try and help us understand something that it isn't even telling us about. So that's the second thing. Now, I want to talk a bit more about the question of appropriation. And some of those comments I've seen have suggested that it would be absolutely wrong for you even to be thinking about Jesus, even seeing it as marking or pointing to Jesus and reflecting on Jesus at the point when that meal is remembering other things, remembering the Exodus. And I wanted to talk about that a bit more. And I want to make a distinction here. If it is about non-Jews, without any sort of context, Gentiles, without any context of standing with, listening to, respecting Jewish friends, appropriating a more contemporary development, the modern seder meal, then yes, that is unacceptable appropriation, taking something that is not ours. Again, I think for Jews who are Christians, for the Messianic Jewish tradition, absolutely acceptable and right that they should say, look, even in terms of how I think about my people's history since AD 70, I want to say that yes, our fulfillment is in Jesus, is in Yeshua. But I also want to come back to the broader picture, because I think there's a broader question here about how we relate to Judaism, and I want to come back to that question of replacement and fulfillment. Now, my view is this, my approach has always been this, that we don't talk about the replacement of a people, but we can't ignore the fact that there is a new covenant, a covenant that includes Jews and Gentiles. So the Bible doesn't talk about us, the church, replacing Israel. The language in Romans 9-11 is that we are engrafted into God's people, not replacing, engrafted, with an expectation that all Israel, as Romans 9-11 defines it, will be saved. And of course, Paul in Romans 9-11, that all Israel means the people of the promise, the people of faith, that it isn't about your ethnic descent. It is about your trust in the promises to Abraham. And that means that we would want to have a concern, as I said, not with a meal that developed after AD 70 and the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, but we do want to have a real concern about what the Old Testament says, what the Torah says, and the events around the Passover itself. We want to know that history. And we do want to see that as fulfilled in Jesus, because that's very clearly what Jesus is doing at the Passover. Again, not a replacement of a people, an engrafting into a people. But yes, a new covenant, a replacement covenant, if you like, a better covenant. Significantly, not the covenant with Abraham that is replaced, but the covenant with Moses. All the implications of that. And there is a replacement sacrifice. Because what Jesus does is he places himself at the centre of the meal, and not just the Passover meal, but at the centre of the other festivals as well. And he says that the very thing that symbolises, the thing that marks, that is central to these festivals, ultimately in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is replaced with him. Jesus replaces the temple. He's the one from whom living waters flow. Jesus becomes the bread in the festival of unleavened bread. Jesus becomes the sacrifice, and Jesus becomes the eternal sacrifice, and Jesus becomes the Passover lamb. And what Jesus so obviously is doing at Passover is saying, all of this is actually about me. I fulfill it. I fulfill the Passover. This is my body given for you. This represents a new covenant, a covenant that's in the shedding of my blood. And so it's absolutely right to be saying that there is a fulfillment of Passover in Jesus that we want to pay particular attention to when we break bread and drink wine. And I think rightly so on that Thursday before Easter. So don't attempt to replicate a seder meal insensitively and anachronistically as well. But do see how Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, Jesus the Passover Lamb, Jesus whose body was given, his blood was shed, sealing the new covenant. Jesus is the fulfillment of a greater Exodus, a greater Passover. But I would love to hear from you, get your comments, or your reflections as well. You might be thinking, what do we do? We've actually got something like this planned in for next Thursday. I think plans are amendable. Scrap the advertising. Invite people to come and commemorate Jesus' Last Supper before his death. Take a pause on the seder meals. So properly think and reflect those things through. But like I said, I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. I'm sure that there will be challenges and disagreement. I'm sure that for some people I've said too much, for some people I've not said enough. I hope that if you are listening in, particularly if you are from a Jewish background, that I hope that you will hear what I've said as well, with the spirit that it is intended as well. But take care of yourself. The Lord bless you.